This video is going to have a more serious tone than the upbeat style I've typically gone for. It's also going to be a lot more personal. For the past year, I've become entrenched in circles outside where transgender people genuinely occupy. We have a large groupthink problem right now, where people across political viewpoints are increasingly narrowing their social interactions to encompass only the perspectives of those with whom they already agree. This is not productive, as it reinforces what we already think and blinds us to counterpoints and alternative perspectives. The LGBT space isn't unique in forming this tightly controlled groupthink environment. It's something we've seen in religious circles for hundreds of years. But it nonetheless does exist in LGBT circles, and it is incredibly rigid. Holding even one or two opinions outside the accepted queer orthodoxy is enough to get you branded as a hateful bigot and accused of holding homophobic or transphobic ideals. Oh, you want an example? Let's look at me. I've had the local LGBT community up in arms for the past few months because I've expressed that I don't believe children should be allowed to socially transition in schools without notifying parents. You can absolutely disagree with me on that point, but the fact that so many individuals have felt it appropriate to go after me personally for this opinion is illustrative of the consequences of stepping outside of the LGBT orthodox. Now, there is an important distinction I want to clarify before I go further, and that is the difference between LGBT people and LGBT ideology. The first are the human beings who, like all humans, deserve unconditional respect and dignity. I am one of these people, and I also would like to be treated nicely. But separate from this is the ideology, or the system of ideas or ideals, surrounding how we conceive of LGBT matters within society. There are some people who take the mention of the word ideology to be a bad word. But an ideology is just a way of thinking about sociological matters. Communism is an ideology. Conservatism is an ideology. Environmentalism, feminism, and capitalism, ideologies. So let's get this straight from the beginning. When people mention gender ideology, this isn't dehumanizing or dismissive of transgender people. It makes it clear that we're talking about the theories, worldviews, and derivative policies of a particular way of thinking about sex and gender, rather than discussing the individuals themselves. Or in other words, we all have our own gender ideology, and the real question is which one do we want to teach to our children? But here we go, I'm off topic again. So anyways, a year ago, I'm this transgender person who believes in the importance of acceptance, but who also believes that some of the behaviors and thought patterns in LGBT spaces are a bit concerning. But I can't say anything, because that's not what a good LGBT person does. That would be harmful to speak out loud about things. And then I finally had enough. I wanted to expand my horizons to experience diverse perspectives, so I branched out and broadened my social circles. Compared to a year ago, I now spend much more time in center and center-right circles, including many rooted in a religious conservative vantage point. When I started down this path, I really didn't know what I would encounter. The progressive narrative derides everyone on this portion of the political spectrum as hateful towards me. But having spent the first 3 decades of my life in an evangelical Christian church, I knew that wasn't true, or at least it wasn't the entire truth. So I put myself in these situations, partly out of curiosity and partly because I wanted to find real relationships where I could be authentic about the concerns I held with the progression of LGBT ideology. And this has been such a positive experience. I've made a number of really great friendships outside the progressive LGBT bubble. In my attempt to emphasize that acceptance and love can be found within more gender-critical leaning circles, I've spoken of my interactions in as rosy terms as possible. I've done this intentionally because the pushback against me for even engaging with those outside the LGBT bubble has been intense, and I wanted to take a strong position to emphasize how wrong they've been. But I've glossed over something else that happens in basically every group I join. A division inevitably forms. See, the progressive talking points of bigoted individuals who hold contempt for my existence isn't exactly wrong. It's just not universally true either. I've come to discover that in many of these circles, there are two conversations overlapping. One conversation concerns transgender ideology and policy, while the other is explicit hate and disdain towards transgender people's existence. And the thing is, before someone like me shows up, it isn't necessarily clear which individuals hold which viewpoints. Most groups are not even aware that there is this difference between members. It's so easy for us to assume that people share our beliefs, especially within our social circles. So what keeps happening is someone becomes friends with me, they recognize that we have alignment on ideological concerns, and they invite me to join a group or friendship circle. So then I show up, and suddenly a faction forms who are very upset and offended that someone transgender such as myself has been given community within their trans exclusionary sanctuary. This has happened to me multiple times over the past year. I haven't discussed them because these are private circles and I believe those should remain private. But last week, this happened in a context that I can talk about, a Twitter space. For those of you who value your mental health enough not to engage with Twitter, Twitter spaces are these audio chats where hundreds of people can get together for group discussions. 1 or 2 people host the space and speakers are brought forward to carry a discussion. Last Tuesday, I participated in a space about Ontario education hosted by my friends Chanel Fall and Junebug Spitfire. It was a really neat space with a bunch of well-known voices who hold concern with Ontario education. But almost immediately after I spoke on an item, an individual named Maureen Sullivan raised her hand. Once given the floor, she, as politely as possible, expressed displeasure that a transgender person was allowed to participate in this conversation. Now, there's a history with this individual. She's been trolling my videos and posts for the past 6 months, and as you might have noticed from the screenshot I showed earlier, she's one of the few people I've blocked on Twitter. Maureen has gone so far as to accuse me of bad parenting with my child on no other basis than the fact that I'm transgender. And here she was, now publicly derailing a conversation about Ontario education to explicitly call me out as someone who shouldn't be allowed to participate. I had plenty of friends in this Twitter space, and people including Carolyn Brzezinski and Chanel Fall stepped up to defend why they consider my voice valuable in our ongoing conversations. And in the moment, this whole thing didn't really faze me at all. But by the next day, I realized I was bitter. My head was stuck in the night before. There's something disheartening about knowing that your mere presence is enough to rip apart groups and friendships. Because yes, in other cases, I've seen friendships actually end because someone has decided to add me to a group chat. This week I realized how frustrated I've become with the bar that I must prove in order to be allowed into community. The bar of entrance has always been higher for me than others, and I get that. It's not often that transgender people are willing to publicly say the things that I'm saying, so it's natural to be met with a certain element of skepticism. But that skepticism can oftentimes be insurmountable. In that same Twitter space last week, towards the end of the conversation, an older man took the microphone and started yelling at me for grooming children in schools and all the usual rhetoric. And I'll remind you that I've spent the last 12 months publicly speaking against this behavior in school boards across Ontario. And that's what I want to be honest about in this video. These experiences have given me newfound appreciation for why the LGBT bubble has formed in the way that it has. With so much intolerance towards transgender people, you need to be pretty thick-skinned to withstand some of the hate. Given the choice between facing such abuse or staying in an LGBT space where you are affirmed, protected, and loved, it's not very hard to understand why people choose the latter. This is why the LGBT filter bubble exists to begin with. What I've come to learn is that most people in center and center-right leaning circles are kind, loving people who want to respect me as a person, even if they disagree with my life choices. I can work with that. For myself, I'm staying put right where I am because it's authentic to my beliefs and because I think center and center-right spaces are better off when whatever internal bigotry might exist is brought to light. And as a reminder, by bigotry, I mean actual disdain and contempt for transgender people themselves, not disagreement over ideology and policy. That's always a discussion we should be having. But I do want to challenge those people in center and center-right leaning circles to ask ourselves what we can do to eradicate the hate that does exist. If there wasn't hate here, many of the talking points that LGBT people use to brand all conservatives as hateful would fall apart. I think that would be a wonderful thing. So I put myself into these, there goes my teleprompter. I have this foot pedal for my teleprompter, and if I get too happy, I start stomping my foot, and then the script just goes way up.